morning to introduce you to someone we've been waiting for a long time, President Ashish Vaidya.
Thank you. Good morning. So when I saw this whole time blocked off on my calendar, I really panicked. I said, I need a little bit of time for the 1 o'clock convocation. So she said, don't worry, just come in here and say hello. This is an important gathering because I understand we're going to be talking about the QEP and of course the SACS visit, which is very, very important. So really all I'm here to do is to say welcome. Thank you for all of you for being here. I'm looking forward to seeing all of you this afternoon at 1 o'clock. I'm working on draft 7 right now, so we're almost there, I think. But no, really excited to be here. Thank you for everything that you've done. Hopefully most of you had a good summer, some rest and relaxation. It's going to be a lot of good work ahead of us, so I'm excited to do that and with you. So looking forward to those conversations. I already know some familiar faces, which is a good thing. So hopefully by very soon I'll be really comfortable and get a chance to know all of you, and I'll be certainly coming around quite a bit. So again, thank you all for being here. This is very important work. I've been at two different institutions in California, then one in St. Cloud, Minnesota. Went through the WASC process twice. Once for initial accreditation, which is a whole new thing that not many of us have had a chance to go through. Remember, the standards are written for re-accreditation, so we had to really make sure WASC understood what it meant to be a new university going for accreditation for the first time. So that was quite interesting. And then, of course, I had experience with HLC, the Higher Level Commission in Minnesota. So, and very different cultures between the two accrediting bodies. So I'm curious to see how SACS is. Yeah, I can see that. Yep. So it'll be my first time, but sort of a third time in a different body. So looking forward to learning about that as well from all of you. Thank you all for being here. I will see you this afternoon.
Thank you, President Vaidya. Well, good morning, and I'd like to welcome you to another academic year. These are all very exciting times for us. So I'd like to first of all acknowledge any new faculty or staff that we have here that are joining us for their first fall semester. Would you stand and be recognized so we can thank you for being here? So this meet, greet, and grab an idea is a yearly tradition here at NKU, and it's where we meet at the beginning of the academic year and discuss topics that will enrich us all and help us to work together as a team. Well, this year, as we prepare for the reaccreditation visit with SACS, an essential part of that process, as you probably know, is the planning and implementation of a Quality Enhancement Plan, or the QEP. And the QEP will be described to you in more depth in a few minutes, but this is a chance for NKU to show how we can take an initiative that will improve learning and teaching across the institution, incorporate it into our practice and into our culture as an institution. Now, some of you may have seen the recent article in the Chronicle of Higher Education on how to teach information literacy in an era of lies. The author argues that all of us, no matter what our discipline, should be teaching information literacy. While this may just seem like another thing that you have to add on to all the things you're packing into your courses, he describes information literacy as one of those meta skills that lurk behind the ability to master any subject. So how can students succeed in a course if they don't know how to understand, assess, evaluate, and apply information to solve problems or answer questions? This article provides just one example of many articles, many voices, calling out for the need for us to ensure that our students are becoming information literate. And it goes to show how relevant and how needed our new information literacy focused QEP really is. So today, as we have the official kickoff of the QEP, and by the way, when Sachs comes, they will randomly ask faculty, staff, and students on campus, what is your QEP about? Yes, students, yes, students. Yes, students as well. So when they do, what is going to be the answer? Right, thank you. So that's our kickoff today. And you'll all have a chance to learn more about information literacy and how you can integrate it into your courses and your programs. There'll be a lot of opportunities for us in the coming months and years, because this is a 10-year process, our QEP. But it will be a truly campus-wide initiative. Faculty play the driving role in the QEP, and everyone will be impacted by it, and everyone will have opportunities to engage in it. So I'm looking forward to this morning as our kickoff. I want to remind you, as the president did, about the convocation. It usually has been on Fridays this year, and probably forever more, will be on Monday afternoon at 1 o'clock here, in the Student Union Ballroom. And then also we have new faculty orientation today at 3 p.m. in University Center 135, just downstairs. So I wish you an enriching day and a successful beginning to an exciting year. Thank you. Jen Celia and Jane Hammonds will come up and kick us off.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm the chair of the QEP committee, so I'm here to talk just for a couple minutes about the selection process and what the QEP means for us. And then I'll turn it over to Jane for some comments about information literacy more specifically. So to begin, as Sue was saying, this really is an opportunity for the entire university, and from the start, this has been a very faculty and staff and student-driven process. Last fall, we began the process to create, implement, and assess a program for student learning called the QEP. And there are two parts to the reaccreditation process. One part is the compliance certification, but the more important part is the QEP. That's the promise that we make to our students to improve student learning, and we have to show that to Sachs. Every university needs to create a QEP and implement it, but the focus of that QEP is entirely up to the university. So we pick what we'd like to do. The only things that Sachs cares about really for this is that the QEP meet the specific needs of the university, that it is faculty, staff, and student driven, and that it's supported with sufficient university resources. So we started out last fall by creating a committee for the QEP, and these are the members of the committee, so I'll just. And from the start, the committee, you can see that it has a very broad range of individuals from departments, from colleges, and from offices on campus. And together as a committee, we decided to do everything that we could to gather information from as many members of the university community as possible. So we started with a request for feedback about what we could do for our students. And the first thing that we asked was, what are we already doing well? What are the things that faculty and staff and the administration is doing for our students that's working? We also asked what were the topics that we could improve on. And finally, we asked, what would we like our students to leave with? When they graduate, what kinds of skills and abilities do we want them to have? So we sought advice from students, from staff, from part-time faculty, from full-time faculty, from administrators, and from members of the community at large. And we used a blend of focus groups, surveys, you probably got one in the mail, in your email, and we also used open forums. And together, as a committee and as a campus, we along with data on student achievement and student engagement from IR and other sources, to identify 8 topics. And then we solicited proposals from the campus to, on those topics, related to those topics. Over the course of the year, we vetted 15 proposals, and we again gathered feedback, talked as a committee, listened, had open forums, and we chose 3 proposals to develop into full proposals that could possibly be the QEP. We gathered more feedback, and together the committee met and talked about all the proposals and the feedback, and the committee was unanimous in its choice on information, to make information literacy the QEP, and that mirrored all of the feedback that we got from students, faculty, staff throughout the process. So this is definitely a campus-wide decision. The last thing I'll say before I turn it over to Jane is, in the spring, Jane and I took the QEP Roadshow out, and we talked to a number of different groups on campus about what the QEP would be and what it meant for us going forward. And one of the groups was the Student Government Association. And they were probably the most enthusiastic group of all that we talked about. They're very excited about this topic. So I think we can look forward to students who also recognize that this is a very important subject for them. So with that, I will turn it over to Jane, who is the leader of the QEP implementation team. So everything that's happening today and has been happening over the summer has been a result of Jane and her team, and so she'll tell you a little bit more about that.
Thank you, Jen. You guys hear me? As Jen said, I just want to take a couple minutes to talk about what we hope to achieve with the QEP and how we plan to implement it. And then our presenter today will talk more about information literacy and the framework for information literacy, which you all have copies of on your table. The framework is the document that we are using to guide our understanding of information literacy. It's perhaps a little bit different than some of you might think of what information literacy is. So you can take a look at that, and Sharon will talk much more about that in her presentation. So the goal of the QEP is for the strategic and purposeful integration of information literacy into the NKU curriculum, so that we can prepare our students to be able to both effectively and ethically navigate the very complex information environment in which we live. That is one in which we all have access to tremendous amounts of information all of the time in multiple different formats, and we have to figure out how to make sense of all of that information. Having all of that information available has many benefits, but it also creates challenges, especially in determining what information we should trust. So our goal, as I said, we want the strategic and purposeful integration of information literacy into the curriculum. By strategic, we mean that information literacy will be integrated into the curriculum in those areas where it will have the most impact. And by purposeful, we mean that we will make a determined effort to teach information literacy skills and concepts to our students, and to assess whether or not they are learning those skills and concepts, rather than hoping that students will develop those on their own. As we were writing the plan, one of the reasons why we thought information literacy would be appropriate for our QEP is because it connects with so many of NKU's already existing values and focus areas. Information literacy definitely connects with our focus on student success. We think that to be successful not only academically, but also professionally and personally, our students will need to be information literate. There's been a growing emphasis nationwide and also on our campus on undergraduate research, and information literacy definitely collects closely with undergraduate research. Critical thinking, of course, we all want our students to be critical thinkers, and information literacy and critical thinking are very closely connected. We also think that information literacy connects with our emphasis on diversity and inclusive excellence. One of the goals of having our students become information literate is that they are able to effectively engage with the information environment. They understand how information is accessed, created, shared, and they recognize that that access is not the same for everyone. That there are different groups, different individuals who have different levels of access, and that can have a negative impact on them. So we think they're closely connected to issues related to social justice, diversity, and inclusive excellence. And finally, we think it has a close connection with our emphasis on faculty development, and I'll talk more about that in just a second. So how do we plan to implement our students are able to meet information literacy learning outcomes that we have identified, and Sharon's going to mention those in her speech. And we want to create an organizational change that will see that information literacy is integrated into programs across the curriculum. And to do that, there is going to be a significant focus on faculty development. In many ways, as the provost mentioned, faculty are at the heart of the QEP, because it's faculty that are going to be the ones that are integrating information literacy into their courses, that are integrating information literacy into their programs, and so faculty are really going to be driving the QEP forward and making sure that our students are developing these skills and understanding these concepts. One of the things that we have done to already start to improve, improve faculty development is we have created an information literacy discipline ambassador program. And basically, each year we will select a number of faculty who will become information literacy ambassadors. And in that role, they will not only revise at least one of their own courses to include a significant information literacy component, they will also be the ones leading the charge in their department and campus-wide to incorporate information literacy into their programs and across campus. We have selected our information literacy ambassadors for this year. Already this past summer in June, they attended our first Faculty Summer Institute on Information Literacy, where we spent 3 days with them, and we talked a lot about information literacy and about course design and how they could integrate information literacy into their courses. I would like to take just a minute to acknowledge our first group of ambassadors and ask them to please stand when their name is called. Ada Jinji from Organizational Leadership. Rhonda Davis from Integrative Studies. Sarah Dragic from Electronic Media and Broadcasting. Yaw from Manso from Philosophy. Kathleen Fuegan from Psychological Science. David Kine from Honors. Tamara O'Callahan from English. Bianca Prather-Jones from Teacher Education. Karen Tapp from Social Work. And Brandolyn Tozel from Teacher Education. And I would also take 1 minute just to introduce the rest of my team who worked very hard on the Summer Institute as well as all of the preparations for today. Andrea Brooks from Steele Library, Mary Chestnut from Steele Library, and Lynn Warner from Steele Library. As the provost mentioned, there will be lots of opportunities for everyone on campus to engage with information literacy throughout this year, throughout the coming years. We're going to be having monthly workshops on information literacy. We're going to be providing instructional resources, reading lists, sample assignments, sample activities. We're going to have a QEP website where everyone can go to access resources. And we will also have additional faculty summer institutes. So if you were not able to be an ambassador this year, there will be times throughout the next few years where you'll have a chance to apply to become an ambassador yourself. One quick thing before I introduce our speaker, we do have some still empty chairs up here. So if anyone would like to come and join a table, we encourage you to do so. We have copies of our framework booklet, we have some handouts. We're going to encourage some discussion. So if you do have an empty space at your table, you can quickly raise your hand. So obviously, normally they're all at the front, but all right, so the last thing I would like to do is to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Sharon Mader. She is the Library Dean Emeritus and a professor at the University of New Orleans. She was formerly the Visiting Program Officer for Information Literacy for the Association of College and Research Libraries. Since its publication in 2015, she has devoted herself to presenting about, advocating for, and communicating with others about the new framework for information literacy for higher education. She is also the winner of the 2018 Miriam Dudley Instruction Librarian Award from the Association of College and Research Libraries. This honor recognizes a librarian who has made a significant contribution to the advancement of instruction in a college or research library environment. So would you all please join me in welcoming Dr. Sharon Mader.
Looks like the same presentation, but it's not. So I'm really happy to be here today and see everybody because it's quite amazing to see the level of involvement for this at this campus. And having been involved in SACS reaccreditation visits at 2 different institutions and being a co-author of the QEP, which we did on the first year experience, and that was at University of New Orleans. We handed in that and what was then called the self-study the day before Katrina, so we got kind of put back a bit in our efforts to do that. But and I've also been on a visiting team for SACS, so seeing it from the inside. So it's indeed true, as was said earlier, they do ask people randomly on campus, and so in fact, it might be a good idea as you leave to kind of have that tattooed on your palm so you can kind of surreptitiously look if they ask you, because they do that. They come, they look in file cabinets, they look in computer files, they're everywhere, so clean out your closets before they get there. That's all I can say. But otherwise, I must say that I'm really impressed with the QEP here, that Jane and group have done an incredible job in just organizing it, and I think certainly that's why it was chosen, but it's also why it should be very successful with the SACS people, because that's exactly what they look for. They want to know that you have a whole plan and that it's going to be laid out and involve the entire campus, including students, and also that you're going to have a way of assessing what the results are, which surely this will allow you to do, as well as being something that hopefully will kind of energize everyone here. So I hope that's what will happen. So first, we're going to find out where you all are. Before we begin, and before I talk about what kind of the definitions of information literacy are from various perspectives, we want you all at your tables. First, we have note cards there, so we're going to start out first by having everybody take a card, and you're going to take a couple minutes then to write down what you think information literacy is. So we can even take up to 5 minutes depending.
So hopefully that you were able to exchange a bunch of things. So did you have some ideas you wanted to share in terms of what you think information literacy is? Because I think Jane can go around with the microphone unless people have their classroom voices. Whichever you prefer. Oh, it's over there? You want to just stand up or get the microphone? Yeah, Lynn can bring the microphone.
Hello? Okay. I wrote, information literacy is the skills you need so you get what you want out of sources of information instead of sources of information getting what they want out of you. And then what was interesting as we went around the table is a lot of people focused on exactly what those skills were, having the motivation, critical thinking, being discerning, those types of things. So it was a nice fit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. Anyone have a comment over here?
Yeah, what I have is knowledge and skill in accessing, navigating, and using information for decision making and action. Especially among practitioners. It's actually about action taking, but decision making before then, getting all the information that's needed.
Yes, thank you. Other ideas? Okay.
I'll use my speaking voice. Okay? All right. I teach in Science 110, which is Simsam Forest Integrated Science, and this really touches upon many of our objectives and goals in the course. I said that information literacy is awareness of available resources, which is everything digital, audio, visual, as well as traditional, understanding how to access, appropriateness of the resources, and then assessment of quality and objectivity of those resources, and then answering the basic critical things in the question, is it true? And then proper referencing of those in whatever you're integrating those resources into.
Anybody else? Those are all really good. Oh, here, someone here.
I just wanted to add a couple of points. I think it's sort of embedded in it, but I was thinking about more of the legality aspect of it in terms of copyright, patent rights, when you're producing some things and you put it on there. Because there's so many things that are just, you just post and it gets on there. So that's another part of the information that students need to be aware. So when they create, when does it require
Yes.
the, the copyright and all of that?
Exactly. Well, those are all really good, and I'm sure that many of you had those and other kinds of things here. And that image before was kind of like the age of the network, which is what we're in now. And so this is from the Association of College and Research Libraries, from the framework, the booklet that you have. This is the definition that's kind of the guiding definition for our profession. So it's integrated abilities, it's the reflective discovery of information, understanding how information is produced and valued, and use of information in creating new knowledge, and participating ethically in communities of learning. So I think those were some of the things that you talked about, but I think the idea of the reflective piece, and certainly a new part of it is now students are creators as well as consumers, and this ethical, which is really what you were talking about, the ethical aspect of it. Now here are the QEP outcomes for this institution, so that NKU students will graduate with skills and dispositions necessary to effectively and ethically engage with information. So if you look at these outcomes, you'll see many of those points there, that they'll understand what information literacy is, this idea of the creation, accessing, disseminating, valuing, using, critically evaluate all these different aspects, utilizing it effectively and ethically, and then reflecting on personal characteristics and habits necessary to effectively engage. So curiosity, open-mindedness, persistence, adaptability, all those kind of things that we want them to leave with. So those are the QEP outcomes, which you'll be learning a lot more about, and the kinds of things that then you would be incorporating into your classes. So we know, of course, that there are multiple literacies, and I'm sure as you thought about it, you thought, well, there's information literacy, but then we have, data literacy, we have visual literacy, we have computer literacy, we have numeric literacy, news literacy, all these different pieces. But I guess what I would feel is that information literacy really is this umbrella that crosses all of those kinds of literacies, and it crosses all of the disciplines. And besides even disciplines, I think the whole idea of the research process is also this kind of threshold concept that we want to address. So I see it as an umbrella and everything fitting under that. And what we're really talking about, it certainly is skills that people are getting, but it's also really, it's a way of knowing and doing. It's a way of thinking that we're trying to instill in students, and that's perhaps what the difference is. So we're talking about not doing things differently, but doing different things. So kind of back to Katrina again. Here, there were a lot of dead trees around, so what people did then is they turned the dead trees into art. And that's, hopefully what we can do here is see things in a new way. So we're going to be doing different things. This looks kind of ominous with this. When I looked at this background, looks a bit ominous. But every year, the Chronicle of Higher Education does their trends report, and I'm sure a lot of these look familiar. This is the one from 2017, where information literacy was the first on their list, but some of the others, of course, graduation rates were always being pounded on that, student success, big data, the campus under siege in various ways, online learning spaces, accountability certainly coming at us, budget cuts. All of these things are very real, that anyone at any institution of higher education would recognize these, but certainly that information literacy was the first. And actually, the article that Sue mentioned was one that I was also going to mention, that idea of teaching information literacy in an era of lies, and also people have referred to it as the post-truth era. And I know I heard on NPR the other day, they had a former ethics lawyer from the White House who said that it was really more important to think about optics rather than ethics. So I think if you think about that as the new approach to journalism. And he was serious about it, of course. So why should we teach information literacy? We know that we're inundated, we and all of us are inundated by all of these kinds of things, all of these different news sources, some of them credible, some of them not. And one of the differences, again, in the age of the network and social media, is that everyone is now a creator. So we're not just consumers, everyone is a creator, which means certainly that we're responsible, but it also means that there are things out there that, you know, we have no idea where they're coming from. So again, as I said before, it is about sources, but it's also more about a way of thinking about these things. It's also a way of thinking about our own relationship to information. So in that reflective piece, it's really important to understand what our own biases are and our own perceptions. And in fact, in that same article, that David Gublar article that was mentioned, he talks about that confirmation bias, the idea of only finding sources, of course, that agree with our point of view and ignoring those other pieces, which we know is something, not only students do that, but you know, I'm sure that we might find ourselves guilty of that as well. So that confirmation bias, and also that idea of if you find a source, I mean, certainly determining if it's authoritative, but also continuing to search for the source of that source. How can you actually corroborate that? So these are all the different kind of things that are out there. So now you certainly are familiar already with this kind of logo. So the framework for information literacy for higher education was created by, it was actually, of course, a task force that spent a number of years with lots of input and feedback from the profession. I think they actually did a Delphi study with identified experts, where then they did a number of rounds to come up with the actual concepts that are contained here. So this is our guiding document that came out in February of 2015, and I spent like 2 years as a visiting program officer implementing that. And I must say, at the very beginning, it really was kind of a philosophical struggle, because for many people, certainly in our profession, librarians are extremely practical people, you know, and they wanted things to be kind of laid out. This isn't like that. This is kind of, as learning is, this is a lot messier in some ways, and it's much more conceptual. It says it's called a framework intentionally. That's an intentional, almost like metaphor. So it's interconnected core concepts, and it's flexible. It's not a set of standards, that it's not prescriptive, which is how we kind of used to do things. And it has these conceptual understandings that bring a lot of things together, certainly about information, about research, about scholarship, the kinds of things that we all share. So that we used to have what was called the competency standards. And so that was the definition on the left, that was the competency standards, which were created, I think, in 1999 or 2000 by ACRL. So it's a set of abilities requiring individuals to recognize when information is needed, have the ability to locate, evaluate, and use. And so that's rather step by step. And I'm sure in the past, sometimes I think people think of, you know, when the librarian comes to class, what they're going to do is like show people maybe how to find things in the catalog and how to search a database. It's this very step-by-step kind of thing, which gives students, in a sense, an unrealistic sense of what it's really like to do research. And so now with the framework, you see that definition on the right, which is the one that we saw earlier. So it's a very different approach, and it has a different purpose. So it does have 6 frames, and each one of those is a concept that's central to information literacy, and they are anchored in threshold concepts, which we're going to be talking about in a minute. So again, it's not a linear set of skills or search techniques, but what's important, I think, is this idea of prompting questions. So what learners will need to know, experience, and do to demonstrate their increased understanding as they progress from novice to expert. And so it's meant to address that whole range, certainly in academics, but beyond that. So it's certainly not linear, it's meant to be iterative. So now, and luckily everyone has their very own copy, which I certainly carry mine around with me, but It's like, it's not exactly pocket size, but still, you could easily fit it somewhere. And I realized when I looked at this, I had the Unpacking the Framework is supposed to be up higher, that's the heading, but in any case, it's made up of these three basic pieces. So the frames, which are the central concepts, the knowledge practices, which are how learners will demonstrate their increased understanding, and that's meant to be within disciplines, and of course it plays out differently in different disciplines. And then the dispositions, which are beyond just the cognitive aspect, so it's got this affective, the attitudinal, the valuing dimensions, which we know are all part of learning. So in anybody who's embarked on research, whether you're a student or even if you're a seasoned researcher, as you're starting on a project, you might initially feel very optimistic, and then as you get into it and you realize that it's a lot muddier than you thought and you're not finding what you need, you kind of have this emotional reaction to it, and you know, that emotional piece of it follows through. But here particularly, the valuing dimension is also very important. So this is too small to read, but inside the book itself, that we have the frame, we have a definition, a brief definition of each frame, and then there's a much longer description that really goes into what it really means, and also describes what it means for novices and what it might mean for experts. And then the knowledge practices, so they're in a sense like outcomes. So learners who are developing their information literate abilities are able to do these things. And then the dispositions, again, as they're developing, they're able to do these kind of things like develop an open mind, develop an awareness, those kinds of things. So that's all in here for each of the frames. So here are the frames. Now this is what was identified by the experts in our profession, but it doesn't mean that these are certainly the only ones. And so this was meant to be, you know, a dynamic document that as it was used and developed, we would discover things as we went along. So that authority is contextual and constructed, information creation as a process, information has value, research as inquiry, scholarship as conversation, and searching as strategic exploration. So that's our whole new description of what we want people to be able to do, and we're going to be exploring those a bit further. But those are the core concepts. So now what we want to look at is how then does the framework link us to kind of the rest of the academic endeavor? How is it related to the whole idea of student success and student learning? So we have these three basic foundations, which are meta-literacy, threshold concepts, and understanding by design. So you may be familiar with those three elements, because what the framework does is really link us to other movements and endeavors in higher education. So in meta-literacy, this is where we get this critical self-reflection and the affective dimension, that idea of thinking about thinking, the metacognition, which is what you want students to be able to do. And then again, students as creators, which is a totally different role than what they had before. And certainly, particularly within the digital world, we're able to allow students to be able to do that even within any of your courses. And threshold concepts, which identify really the stuck places that happen to students in their learning, not just in information literacy, but in any discipline when they're dealing with those core concepts. And a key there is what they're calling this transactional curriculum design, with the idea it's faculty, it's other educators, so you'd have certainly librarians, instructional designers, instructional technologists, anyone who's involved in that kind of learning, and the students as well, because they're really the only ones who can tell us, I mean, what are they learning from what we're teaching, or what are they not learning from what we're not teaching? So that's really important. And then the idea of the liminal space, which we'll look at in a minute, and then this whole thing of the novice to expert spectrum, then understanding by design, which has as its base the enduring understandings, the essential questions, the backward design process, a three-step process, and that students taking charge of their own learning, coming to their own conclusions rather than us, of course, telling them what those are, and then the transfer of learning and how does that happen. So if we look at meta-literacy, one of the key books, certainly this is written about in other areas, but in our discipline, meta-literacy, this book, and there's one following, so it's Reinventing Information Literacy to Empower Learners by Mackey and Jacobson, who are at SUNY Albany. But again, it's this overarching set of abilities, and students are consumers and creators. And besides cognitive, we have behavioral, affective, and metacognitive aspects. So this whole idea of reflection, which is also going to be a powerful way of assessing what students learn. And then threshold concepts, I don't know how many people are familiar with that, if that's something newer, if you already know about that. So Jan Meyer and Ray Land first brought this out in 2003. They're from the UK, so their seminal paper was Threshold Concepts and Troublesome Knowledge, Linkages to Ways of Thinking and Practicing Within Disciplines. So you can see this has been over 15 years now, and there's just a lot of research and practice that has gone on with this. In fact, just in June, I went to the, I think it was like the 8th, the Threshold Concepts Conference that was at Miami University this time, where there were scholars from around the world who came together from different disciplines to talk about their research with threshold concepts. So it's the idea of how do you know and think and practice within a discipline. So you see this image of the portal. Now clearly there's the idea of a threshold, that students have to cross this threshold to have the real learning. And we're, as experts, we're way on the other side. So sometimes it's very difficult to look back through that pathway and remember what it was like not to know the things that you know. So often your knowledge is kept as a very intrinsic kind of thing that's not transparent to the students. And so that's kind of what we're looking at here, of how do you look back over that pathway and help them to cross over that same threshold. Now clearly this isn't something that happens, it doesn't happen overnight, it doesn't happen in one course. Certainly over an entire curriculum is what you want to try and get toward. And it's this kind of shared understanding. So these are the basic characteristics that they identify. So transformative, so a threshold concept is transformative in that there is a change in identity, and that always happens no matter what kind of learning there is. It's not just something that you're sticking in your head, you're actually being changed by it. Irreversible, so you're unlikely to forget it. So a simple example, obviously riding a bike, I can remember the first time I learned how to ride a bike and looking back and realizing that my dad wasn't holding on anymore. But you don't forget that. But just something like a core concept like something like gravity, once you know about gravity, it changes your whole view of the world and you're not likely to forget that. So integrative, it connects things that previously may have seemed unconnected in your learning, and bounded so that within each discipline or conceptual area, things are bounded. It doesn't mean that they can't move across the boundaries, but that there are these different conceptual areas. And troublesome, meaning particularly for students or for anyone who's approaching a new area of learning, it's something that's going to be, in a sense, alien. It might seem counterintuitive, and it's going to be troublesome in that it's something that's confusing and that makes you uncomfortable. So that brings us to that liminal space, which is that space where and I'm saying students, but in essence, it's anyone who's a learner, as we are today in this room, so I'll say students. But if you're in the liminal space, it's that space before you cross that threshold, where it is kind of uncomfortable, you're not clear, you don't understand the concepts, and you may be understanding it at a very superficial level. But that liminal space is very common, and indeed, there is also research, people who are writing in the area of faculty development talk about faculty development as a liminal space, as indeed it is for those people who are willing to jump into it. And so I think we can consider ourselves in that space, and that requires this kind of critical self-reflection. So to me, when I look at some of the threshold concept research, two of the things that really stand out, and I mentioned this earlier, it's this dialogue that has to exist so that you're not just teaching by yourself. Obviously, that the way that you're doing this is finding out from students, collaborating with others to create the threshold concept framework, which is essentially your learning framework, and finding out from the students what they're not learning, and then the stuck places. So this is from Glynis Cousin, who's one of the foremost researchers in that area, saying broadly, the purpose of threshold concept research is to explore difficulties in the learning and teaching of subjects to support the curriculum design process. So that's, we're going to be exploring that a bit today, but that's the kind of thing that you will be doing as well. So where are students getting stuck? And so again, when we talk about threshold concepts, in each of your discipline, there are those threshold concepts. And certainly some disciplines have actually put those out from a professional association, whatever, as here are those kind of concepts that are central to our discipline and practice. So you may recognize in your own discipline that you have those, or you certainly can know what those are. And Wiggins and McTeague, Understanding by Design, first came out in 1998, and I think for a lot of people, it's so simple, but it was kind of an eye-opener. This is a second edition, I think it's 2005. So what they emphasize is starting with those essential questions. Now, a lot of their work was really done in K through 12, but it's been adapted a lot for higher ed because it's very valid, and sometimes in K through 12, they might pay more attention to some of these kind of things. So what is worth understanding, the idea of uncoverage, and then again, this novice to expert. So what they do is say you've got to start with the essential questions, these big ideas, enduring understandings. So what do we want students to be able to understand and be able to connect to new ideas? I mean, years from now, after they leave your class, some of those details and facts are not going to stick with them, and that's probably not as important. But you want them to be able to have this understanding that's also going to allow them to transfer learning, so that if they're in your class, in biology, for example, how does that transfer to history? The kinds of things that they've learned, how do they see those connections? Because to them, maybe they're not going to be a biologist or a historian, but that doesn't matter so much as the idea that they're taking away some of these ways of looking at the world, that they can see the connections and they will take those with them. So that's what we start with when we think about where is it that we want them to be at the end. Now, uncoverage, and I feel like I'm kind of violating that because I'm trying to pack as much as I can into this, but the uncoverage, the idea, it's in contrast to that kind of banking theory of education or the attic theory where you're kind of like sticking as much as you can into people's heads, but you're really trying to uncover what are those key things that you want to do. And so you're not going to be able to cover everything, obviously, but as you do that, you don't cover everything, but also you're uncovering the things that are the complex, abstract, and counterintuitive, those things that might be intrinsic that you understand, but they don't. You're bringing that out with this active questioning. They've got to practice trying it out, and importantly, rethinking what they thought they knew. So they certainly come with their own preconceptions, but uncoverage is one of the things that they emphasize. And then this idea of from novice to expert. So it's from naive to sophisticated, from simplistic to complex, as opposed to merely right or wrong, and so that we know that students, certainly when they come in as freshmen, have that more dualistic perspective of the world, and it's either, black or white or things, they don't necessarily have those nuances, but that this is what that we want them to understand. And if you think about it, in reality, some of the questions may remain the same. It's just that the answers become more sophisticated as they go along. But that's particularly what's emphasized if you look at the frame descriptions here. And then their backward design process, it looks so simple, and you may be familiar with this. So step one, identifying desired results. So where do we want them to be? So that's essentially, once you think about, the essential question and enduring understanding, what is it that we want them to understand at the end of the course, at the end of the year, 5 years from now, and then developing learning outcomes based on that. So identifying desired results. Secondly, determining acceptable evidence. So how do we know that they learned? What assessment methods are you going to use? And then that's going to really tell you what your learning experience and instructional strategies are going to be. So you don't start with step 3. So you don't sit down and say, well, here's what I'm going to do in class. You start at the top, which is where do I want them to be at the end. And so, and this may be on a list, on resource list that Jane will have available, I guess, on the website, but what we've developed at the ACRL site is what we're calling the Framework Toolkit that has lots of information about the structure of the framework. It has things about the foundations, much more about threshold concepts and meta-literacy and understanding by design, and then strategies for using it. So this is all available, freely available, and maybe something that you want to take a look at.
And let me just add, I know everyone did not get a printed booklet of the framework. We are going to order more of those, so if you did not get one and you want one, just send me an email or come up after, and we'll put everyone on the list, and we'll get everyone a booklet.
Oh, and I should mention, because we have so little time, we're not really taking a break, but anyone, if you do need to get up, you should just, feel free to get up, but you do have to come back then. So, so I'll watch if you get up, and I'll watch if you come back. So, now we're going to move into kind of a next phase, which is part 2, where do students have trouble, and how can we help them? So now, hopefully, people have, oh, yours doesn't have, yours, yeah.
Everyone should have, anyone who does not have a handout.
This handout that's got the ever-present logo, and on the back, it's got the frames. Okay, so with this, what we're going to do then, is we want to identify information literacy stuck places in student learning. So think back to the definition and scope of information literacy that we discussed. So you're going to use, on the back of this, there are frame descriptions. So if you look on the back, you'll see the frames, and there's a little paragraph description, so you can familiarize yourself with that. So look at those, and what you'll do then is, again, hopefully there are note cards or on the back of your other note card. What you want to do is identify where your students have the most difficulty. Now we know some people, I think here, are not necessarily in teaching roles, but in whatever role you have then, if you're not in the classroom, think about the role that you're in and where students may have difficulties. So using these frames, I guess pick one of the frames where you think they have the most difficulty, and then kind of articulate what a stuck place might be for your students. And then we're going to talk about those. So does that make sense? Do you have a question about what we're going to do? My question, first I want to ask a couple questions, and then we'll hear some ideas. So first, I'd really like to know which frames people identified. So maybe people can just raise their hands. So how many people looked at authority as constructed and contextual? Okay. Well, they're all yes, they're interconnected, so you may not have just looked at one. So information creation as a process. Did anyone do that? Oh, okay. Information has value. Okay. Research as inquiry. Okay, scholarship as conversation. And then searching as strategic exploration. Okay, so as you think about those, do you think in any way might those differ by discipline or by the level of the student, or probably, but yeah, and as you said, they're interconnected as well, so you probably wouldn't necessarily just be focusing on one of them, so that's true as well. So did anyone want to share what some of those stuck places were that they identified for their students? Yeah. Here, maybe Jane can bring the microphone so you can.
Again, I think all of those frames are really important and interconnected.
Mm-hmm.
I reflected on the information creation as a process.
Is it on?
Oh, sorry. Okay, thank you. I reflected on information creation as a process, and I find that my students are, quite good at finding information, and maybe also, often at selecting that information. I find that sometimes they have a hard time finding their own voice
Yeah.
in that amount, amount of information that they can access, and not simply, okay, this is all of this, but what do I do
Yes.
with all this, and how do I find my own voice?
Yes, I think that's really important, the student voice and finding it, not just regurgitating, yeah. Who else would like to share a stuck place?
Sorry.
Anyone? Oh, there's someone over there.
I find that my students, they really get stuck with research as inquiry. They have a hard time seeing research as coming up with their own questions to ask. And it really isn't until we start doing scholarship as conversation and they start to understand that they can actually talk to the text, that they start to see that they can ask their own questions. So that kind of has to come first before they can start.
Yeah, very important.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Okay, this one here, Jane.
For me, I think students get stuck focused on the answers, like what's going to be on the test, which becomes problematic when they don't understand information. And the scholarship is conversation is where I think I really connected that it's kind of an ongoing process of knowledge discovery.
Yeah. Okay, let's take one more here. Yes, yes.
I was focusing more on the novice student, the brand new student, and I think oftentimes they look for the easiest way to find the information, and then they get very frustrated, and with the search that they're using, and then they don't consider the whole comprehensive information that's available to them.
Yes. Okay, good. Well, I'm sure people recognized some of those things in what they had put down. And we're going to have a chance to work with that again in just a little bit. But then next, we're going to go back to the backward design process and just look at those 3 steps. So identifying the desired results, and I think this was brought up in your point, that it's important that they see learning as anchored in questions, not answers, and that it's these cycles, it's an iterative process, so that's really important. And so that's how do we introduce them then to these big questions or these enduring understandings. And so that's one way where I think we can use the frames themselves as we look at them to create these kind of essential questions. So, and that's what kind of on this sheet, if you kind of turn some of these things into question form, rather than stating it. And this is just an example from the previous information literacy standards that we had. We might say to students, we want you to access needed information effectively and efficiently. Well, instead of telling them that, what we would really rather have is for them to be asking these kind of questions. So how does the way information is organized affect the way we can access it? How can I make my search both effective and efficient? So if they can ask those questions, then we can together move toward those answers rather than making the statement of, we want you to do this kind of search. Well, what does that mean? So instead of making a statement, we're having them ask these kind of questions, which will be, again, questions they can ask in many different disciplines. They may have different answers. So if we go back to authority is contextual and constructed, so I'm really just using that frame. So an essential question for that might be how or why do we decide if someone has authority on a topic? And how might biases privilege some sources of authority and silence others? So especially in terms of worldview, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic class, all of those kind of things. So those are the kind of questions we want them to be asking. And so then if you have the frames and you have the questions, then those can then lead to the learning outcomes of what we want them to know and do. And so if you took those essential questions, which we just looked at, how or why do we decide if someone has authority, an outcome may be that they will be able to determine attributes of authoritative information for different needs, with the understanding that context plays a role in authority-based attributes. That's kind of a complicated outcome, but probably might not show that to students exactly in that way. It's for us alone. And then the idea of biases, recognizing that traditional notions of granting authority might hinder diverse ideas and worldviews. So we're asking this question and then saying, okay, well then, if that's the question, what would students have to know or be able to do in order to begin to answer those questions? And here's just another example at University of Southern California. These were their outcomes overall for all undergraduates. So it's kind of like the QEP outcomes that we showed at the beginning. They went through each of the frames and had outcomes. So these, again, you can recognize, identify markers of authority, recognized by disciplines, debate the ways privilege influences perception. This third one, which was mentioned before about the idea of that students themselves can be authorities. So if they begin to see themselves that way. So those are different kind of outcomes that you could have. And again, some more examples just with different frames. So the scholarship is conversations. A question is, how do contributions of new insights or discoveries add to or change understanding of a given issue over time? And so the students might be able to map those citations throughout this scholarly conversation on a topic. So those are some of the kinds of things they'd be able to do. How do we know if an author is a credible authority? They could brainstorm characteristics of authors. So those are some of the kind of things they could do, which would tell you what you could actually be doing in class then. So the second step, and we're of course just skipping over these things really quickly, but the second step, determining acceptable evidence. So how will we know they've achieved the outcome? What could they do to demonstrate? So this is where we have to look to new methods of assessment, because particularly as you're looking at threshold concepts, that kind of thing, it's not something that happens easily or in a short period of time. So authentic assessment, the idea of concept mapping, which would be an example of students making their learning visible. So you want to look at means of assessments that's going to make it visible. The idea of student narratives or reflections, hearing what the student voice is. And what some people have done to look at conceptual learning is taking student reflections, for example, over a course, and what they say at the beginning, actually using coding software to code those responses and look at their responses at the end, and you can actually see a change in the way they're using the language, which indicates a different kind of learning in terms of those concepts. So that's something that's being used, that more qualitative approach, and certainly using web pages, e-portfolios, anything that's making their learning more transparent. And so this is all really transformative learning. Now with something like concept mapping, for example, we could say, well, that's going to be an assessment, but that would be something then we could have them actually do in the class. We could have them take a topic and actually map it out. We'd be able to see what their thought process was. And just remembering, of course, that this is just the third step. So we just skipped over those really blithely, but what we are going to do now is, of course, another activity with probably note cards. So you're going to think about, we're going to say what would be strategies then that we could address those stumbling blocks that you addressed. So the frame that you'd identified that poses the biggest stumbling block. So say what, with that stumbling block, what would be, I mean, a learning outcome would be great if you could come up with that, but otherwise if you perhaps have an assignment or an activity you could use to address the stumbling block. So that's what we're going to do now, is go to that next step. So whatever it was you identified then, what would be a learning outcome? See what you came up with. So hopefully you have some outcomes and strategies. And one thing we might want to do is perhaps some of the people who are the ambassadors might be, and they've been working on this for a bit longer, might be willing to share what they've been working on or what they came up with. So would anyone be willing to tell us what they're working on? Anyone can do it. Anyone who has, oh, there's a person.
Oh. What I learned through this process is library is a great resource. My students say it's difficult to evaluate the resources. Which ones are credible, which ones are not credible. And Jane created a great notebook for my students. It teaches them about information literacy as a field. It makes them practice the library databases. So thank you, Jane. So it was my problem, credibility of resources for an assignment. Jane created a module and even a more class discussion.
Good. Great. There's a person over here. Jane? Or Linskin?
Our group picked scholarship as conversation. I think a pretty good tool was that students often don't know how to give critical feedback. So we were thinking about sharing some of our journal article rejections so they could see what is helpful feedback versus what is not helpful feedback.
That's yes, very good. So, would anyone else? Does anyone else have a really creative idea? Oh, we're pointing at someone.
Pointing over here.
Well, I was sharing with my group one of the activities that I utilize on a unit on Roman theater. So I give them each group an envelope of source material to help them learn and identify the difference between a primary and a secondary source and just what those actually are. So the premise, the context is that all of the museums, all of the libraries, everything that deals with Roman culture and life is gone. It's burned down, it's destroyed, it's whatever. Only thing that we have left are in these envelopes. And they have to categorize the artifacts that they find in the envelope. They have to specifically look at the factual details that they can pull from these documents, from these artifacts, and then differentiate again between what is a primary and a secondary source, and then come up with a theory as to what different aspects of Roman life, culture, theater was based primarily on these factual sources. And then later at the end come up with something that's a little bit more nuanced in terms of their interpretation of the data to come up with some non-factual assumptions about the culture. So it's a great way for them to, again, even know, okay, what is a primary source? And, you know, talking about going to an archive and, you know, using the gloves or the different ways in which you interact with these sources, and realizing that it's not difficult to interact with these primary sources, that it's all around us, even our own library on campus. We have access to these types of materials. So,
yeah, that's great. So, anyone else want to share what they came up with? Well, you can keep it to yourselves, but hopefully you'll use it. So, okay, going once, going twice. Trying to think, we may not have to use note cards again. Oh, okay.
Well, just I think that what you shared with us from the Wiggins and McTighe article is really interesting, and we could actually, you know, as students can use it, which is identify the desired results. And when I'm creationist process, you know, one of your first line is to convey a message. And I think that for the students, maybe it will be good to, you know, all of us, you know, in a classroom, to decide that you know, traditional, you know, 12-page paper or whatever they have to write is not just a rite of passage. It is actually a growing experience. And one way to decide what is the message that they want to formulate, and then do what we do on our syllabi, and maybe we can change our whole approach to our syllabi, where the students develop the student learning outcomes instead of us having it on our syllabus, hopefully the first day of class. Yes, we do, all of us. And actually, having the students own the process rather than us giving. So in other words, coming back to them asking the questions rather than us saying, you will be efficient in that, So.
No, that's a really great idea, and that's actually being used in places to have the students help design the curriculum. That's a really great idea. No, thank you. Okay, well, let's move to the next step, which is actually information literacy in the curriculum. So we're going to come back to the umbrella, the idea of information literacy across all the different disciplines. And I want to show an example at, say, the Edwards University, which is in San Antonio. And this is from Brittany Johnson, who was at the Threshold Concepts Conference that I mentioned in June. And so what she was talking about was the idea of this vertical integration of information literacy in the curriculum, so that you're actually breaking it up and starting at these different levels. And so choosing the courses, so obviously rhetoric and composition, those are courses that are generally used for this kind of thing, but then determining what's going to happen above that at the discipline level, so that you're scaffolding it as the students are moving from being novices to experts. So they're actually working on that. And in order to do that, maybe, I guess you can see this, but in order to do this, and probably what you will have to do here at some point, is this idea of curriculum mapping. So, for example, taking one of the concepts, authority, and then looking at the knowledge practices, and what they did was actually determine which of those were appropriate for different levels. So, for example, 1.1, define different types of authority. They said that would go into the Rhetoric and Composition 1 course. And then 1.2, use research tools and indicators of authority to determine credibility of sources. They were going to put that in Rhetoric and Composition 1 and 2. And then the third one, understand that many disciplines have acknowledged authorities in the sense of well-known scholars and publications. That would go into a discipline level course. And so that you're not taking the whole thing at once, but you're breaking it up and determining which are those things that are more appropriate at that beginning novice level and in which courses, and then how does that work. So actually doing a whole curriculum map, which you could, of course, do here to scaffold it across the curriculum. So here's a recent book that's come out from ACRL that's on disciplinary applications of information literacy threshold concepts. And what they did was align disciplinary concepts and ways of thinking with the information literacy threshold concept. So each chapter is written by a faculty in a discipline along with a librarian partner, where they talk about the kinds of things that they're doing. So they're in all areas. I know one of them, for example, in social work, they were using some standards that had come out from the Professional Association and relating those to the information literacy threshold concepts. And here, noting that these are overarching and permeating, and so they underlie other content. So we can kind of quickly look at mapping some of those in these areas: writing studies, women and gender studies, and biology, and then actually doctoral studies, the research as a threshold concept. So people in rhetoric and composition may be familiar with the writing program administrators have developed this outcome statement for first-year composition. So their concepts are rhetorical knowledge, critical thinking, reading and composing, processes, and knowledge of conventions. And then if you map those to the frames, so rhetorical knowledge is related to the frames they have listed there, critical thinking, reading and composing, relating to information as value, scholarship as conversation. So you can look at it in that way of how do these relate, and in reality what we're talking about is almost like starting with like a kitchen table conversation where, like for example, the librarians could sit down with someone in writing studies and talk about, well, what does this mean to you? When you talk about rhetorical knowledge, what exactly do you mean by that, and what do we mean then by, let's say, researcher's inquiry, and how do those relate, and what is it that we can work with students and create, learning outcomes that will get to what we both want them to accomplish. So it's the beginning of a conversation, really. And there are also two other people, Elizabeth Wardle, who's actually at Miami, and Linda Adler-Kasner, who write a lot in writing studies. And so they came out with a book called Naming What We Know, where they actually went through and made explicit what are these threshold concepts. People are using these, but have they really talked together about what it is they think are the core concepts in their discipline? So these are what they came up with in terms of writing studies. And so you can see how a number of these would also relate very easily to the frames. So particularly the social and rhetorical activity, enacting, creating identities, all of those. And they actually have worked with the threshold concepts in information literacy to relate those. Women and Gender Studies, another book that came out with two people who are prominent scholars in the area, and the book is Threshold Concepts in Women and Gender Studies, and again, working with people in their discipline to identify what these are. And so you can see that, again, these relate, particularly the one about privilege and oppression, relates very directly to that kind of social justice aspect of the framework. And then this, David Lopato he's done longitudinal studies for over a number of years of the summer undergraduate research experience. And what he did was look at what were the primary student learning outcomes, and these were 11, I think there were 20, but these were 11 of those that seemed to relate directly to information literacy. So understanding the research process, interpreting results, analyzing data, understanding how knowledge is constructed. Again, this idea of community being part of that, learning ethical conduct. So all of these and understanding how scientists think, which is really what we're kind of up to. What is it that they do when they're practicing science? I mean, how is it that they think, and how are they using information and data and then creating knowledge out of that? So I thought that was very interesting. Then also the AAAS and the NSF came out with a recent report on biological literacy called Vision and Change, and these were the core concepts they identified in biology, which you can see there, which seem logical. But then they also said that for disciplinary practice, you need to have these core competencies. So again, the process of science, and how do you tap into this interdisciplinary nature? How do you talk across these lines, and not just in science, but certainly in science and society? So all of these kind of things that relate way beyond just the discipline itself. And I thought another interesting aspect of that report, which is we're going to talk about in just a bit, is they said in order for this to happen, you have to have this community of scholars and educators. Faculty have to engage in regular conversations, this kind of peer-to-peer mentoring about teaching and learning, which is so important, and then working on improving, testing, and sharing an understanding of how students learn, which is certainly what you're doing today. And then there's this other interesting aspect, which I had come across when I first discovered threshold concepts, which was probably around 2014, but I realized that there's this whole body of work, and again, most of these people are from the UK or they're Australian researchers, but who are looking at the whole research process and saying that the doctoral process itself is a threshold concept, that understanding what happens during that process. It certainly also would be true for undergraduates, but saying that doctorateness is a threshold concept in itself. And that there are these things that people in that liminal state of as a doctoral student have to learn to be able to think and practice like a researcher. And again, and this is the VITA, the Researcher Development Framework, which again, I hate to say, comes out of the UK where a lot of this seems to be happening. But these are the domains that they say that a successful researcher would be able to know and do. So these are the different aspects. And again, and they even, I think specifically had mentioned information literacy was specifically in one of the boxes, probably in knowledge and intellectual abilities, but it also certainly applies in these other categories as well, and there's an ethical dimension here too. So these are the kinds of things that we want people to move towards as they become successful researchers. So again, ACRL has produced another resource. We created this, it's a very robust database called the Sandbox, which is a database that anybody can search, but you can also set up an account for free. You just have to kind of put in some information about yourself, and you can contribute materials. So it's all sorts of instructional resources related to the Sandbox. You can search by discipline. You could also, one of the tags would be the institution. So as you all are developing your materials, you could put them into this repository, which is, of course, globally searchable, and people are able to find these materials. So you can put in not just instructional materials, you can put in, people have conference proceedings and other kinds of things that are there in disciplines. So you could look up, if you just were interested in biology, you could look there to see what kinds of things had people done. So that's something that's an option for you. I mean, you have a repository here, but I know, like at my institution, our repository, we were trying to maintain more for faculty and student research, not so much for instructional materials, so I don't know how you want to handle that here, but this is a resource that's available for you that is, I think, pretty well designed and usable. So now we're just going to go through one other little section, and then of course we'll have an activity at the end. I know you were waiting for that. But first I want to talk about some other kinds of things you can do, the collaborative pedagogical practices. And again, I'm maybe telling you things that you're already familiar with, but certainly Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, the SOTL, decoding the disciplines, and the peer-reviewed assignment design. So the SOTL, Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, and you may recall that back in, I think it was, I have to look, 1990, it was a long time ago, that Ernest Boyer came out with his Scholarship Reconsidered, and at that time he talked about the Scholarship of Teaching, which has since then now become Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. So it was putting an emphasis on pedagogy and trying to, in a sense, transform that kind of hidebound tenure and promotion process, which wasn't putting an emphasis on the kind of work that you're involved in every day, which is teaching, and looking at how do you have this intentional, systematic reflection on teaching and learning, and that then results in these peer-reviewed products that then you're sharing with others. So you're actually evaluating the quality of your teaching and learning, involving students in that, seeing again perhaps where they get stuck, and then doing some improvement, which is the process of the QEP actually. So the QEP is really a good example of a whole SOTL project. And again, you can see at the top, that top quote came from an article that was in the International Journal for Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. So again, there's a whole body of robust scholarship behind this and practice. So many, many people are involved in this at this time. And it really, this kind of pedagogical research really puts a spotlight on it that's important. So decoding the disciplines, I don't know if you've come across this or not. So it's the idea of how do we help students learn these disciplinary ways of thinking. So David Pace and Joan Middendorf at Indiana University, and again back in 2004, so many people have been working with this since then, and it's identifying the stuck places, and it's a process for charting the path between how experts think and then how students think at the beginning. I mean, because they're like this. And it ties together threshold concept theory and then it's kind of practical application. So here's the process. So what is a bottleneck to learning? So we've already done some of that today. And you can do this in a group, or one way that I know Joan does this is you actually interview someone else. And the idea too is that you do it in a multidisciplinary group. And there's actually a lot of research that shows the value of these kind of multidisciplinary collaborations and conversations. And so it's kind of like, you've never seen your own backyard as clearly as when you've gone away and you come back again. So you could do this like as an interview, for example, of interviewing someone else to say, if that's a bottleneck, then how does an expert get beyond that? What is it that you do? What are the steps that you take? And you're explaining that to someone else who's then, in a sense, forcing you to clarify it. And then how can the tasks be modeled? And then how will students practice those steps to continue on and get feedback? What's going to motivate them? How do you engage them? And then what assessments do you use to see how they're mastering it? And then how do you share that? Again, that it's going to be valuable if you're able to put that out there, either with your own group, in your own institution, or beyond that through other kind of, papers or presentations. But it's this whole process of saying, here's where we are, how did we get there, and how do we do it? How can we then tell students and have them do those exact same steps to get to that point? So it's a simple kind of thing that you can certainly do following these steps. Joan, I didn't put that down here, but Joan, they've come out with a new book that's really detailed in terms of each one of these steps and how you do that. So that's a valuable thing to have. And another thing, National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, which is centered at University of Illinois, but it's sponsored by Lumina and Teagle Foundations, who do a lot of teaching and learning work. And again, they do this across the country. They bring people together from different disciplines and different institutions and bring them together. But you can do it, of course, in your own institution. So you bring together a small group, again, multidisciplinary, and you share the assignments ahead of time. And then it's a whole process. You have like a sheet that allows you to ensure you're following this. So you present your assignment to the group, and then you say, here's where I want to improve this. And then they take 15 minutes and they provide feedback, ask you questions and discoveries. And often, because they're not necessarily from your discipline, they're revealing things that might not be as clear to your students. And then they actually have to write feedback for you and give that to you. And so that's a whole process that's used. You can go to their website. They have really incredible materials. So it's people like George Koo and Peter Ewell and Pat Hutchins, people who are really well known in these areas. But I would say you could go there. They've you can make your own little sheet, but it's a really simple process, but it's really powerful. I went to one of their, what they call actually a charrette. I went to one of theirs that they held, and it was very powerful, and people really got a lot out of it. So this just reminds you, you're starting a general conversation, because assignments are a large portion of what students do, but it's a large portion of what you do. And so you can use the assignments you already have, you can create new ones, you could work with people in your own discipline or across disciplines, but it's putting this assignment design into this culture, and so that's why it's important. Now, the courage to teach, so everybody in this room kind of has the courage to teach. You may be familiar with Parker Palmer, who talks about the idea that, of course, teaching is probably one of the most privatized things of any profession, where in reality you're behind a closed door, and people don't necessarily know what happens there. But he's saying that the growth of that craft depends on a shared practice and honest dialogue among the people who do it. So we certainly grow by trial and error. Our willingness to try and fail as individuals is severely limited when we're not supported by a community that encourages such risks. So you can't really do this by yourself. And I think you're fortunate to be at a place that's allowing you the opportunity to do that. But that's really, that conversation is really essential. And so with partnerships, what we want to do is create this culture of teaching and learning and knock down those all too familiar silos and build this culture that's going to be across disciplines, across functions, across roles, bringing in all the kinds of people that are going to be needed to do this. And so faculty learning communities, and I don't know whether you've had some of these here or not, generally they're organized and supported by Centers for Teaching and Learning, and I understand you're going to be kind of revitalizing one of those here. But Milton Cox started it probably like in 1979, again at the ever-present Miami University, but that's where he was. And so he organized the first ones, and they're really a form of communities of practice. So it has kind of a formal definition, so it's cross-disciplinary again, and in general, but as it says, faculty and staff, so the other kinds of people who might be able to contribute to this in terms of the learning process, 6 to 15 members. So it actually has, it's not just like a one-time thing. Generally they're organized so it's kind of a whole year-long kind of thing. You come together regularly. They can be organized around a topic. They can be organized around cohort groups, so you could have beginning faculty, you could have midterm faculty, you could have people who are farther on in their careers, organized by disciplines, different ways to do it. You have a facilitator, and there are various guidelines for how that works. So it's kind of like a leaderless leader in a sense. I mean, you're organizing the group so that they're very effective. There's been lots of research on the effects of this, not just on faculty effectiveness, but also on faculty who participated in faculty learning communities. The actual effect on student learning has been demonstrated. So these have been around for a while, but it's something else that is really useful that can be done. I mean, it doesn't mean you couldn't just get together over lunch with people. You know, pick a group of people who want to do this. There are those things called teaching squares where I think 4 people get together and do something similar to this kind of thing. But the point being, it has to be intentional, you know, otherwise it doesn't really happen. So if we look at this framework for change, it might be kind of hard to see this, but you see at the center, of course, is student learning, but everything is interrelated here. And this is from Pat Hutchins and Mary Dean Sorcinelli, who are really well known in whole higher ed field. Certainly Mary Dean has done lots of work in the whole area of faculty development. Pat Hutchins has just done lots of writing on higher education, and particularly on change, the change process. And they say here that there are these 4 levers. So we have professional development, which of course we can call that faculty development. I think a newer term again is educational development, which recognizes that there are more people than just strictly faculty involved. And that again, that just doesn't happen. Even these conversations about teaching and learning have to be intentional and have to have someone kind of organize that. Then they have resources, and they said when they did their research, of course, as you could well recognize, that time is one of the resources that's really something that no one has in abundance. And so that's why some of these structures and ways of doing it are ways that people can effectively improve what they're doing as a process and still be able to incorporate it, but gaining the collaboration and the wisdom of others as well. And then, of course, incentives and rewards. So in the tenure and promotion system, and we also know that there's kind of like perhaps norms about what faculty work is or faculty status, what that should be. But in terms of tenure and promotion, there certainly moves toward a recognition of, the value of pedagogy and pedagogical research as well. So I think that that's changing, providing incentives like whether it's grants or other kinds of funding for that. And then the leadership, which now the QEP we know is kind of coming from the ground up, but you clearly have support of the leadership here, and you have to have certainly the faculty and the administration. If that can come together and all of them have like the same perspective on what they want to happen, that's really important. So in order to create this culture of institutional change, clearly everyone has to become a change agent, because that's really what this is about. I think we're really changing the way that higher education works. And in a sense, what you're doing is saying other people are kind of telling us to be accountable and telling us to change, but in reality, you can take charge of that yourself, and you can make that kind of accountability and assessment come from within and drive that forward, which is what you're really doing with the QEP. So now, what we're going to do is think about that with these kind of questions. So, at your tables then, what you're really about is integrating information literacy into the curriculum here. So, the questions are the students here graduating with the knowledge, skills, and values needed to effectively engage with information in their academic, professional, and personal lives? So if you say yes, how do you know? What are you using now to know that? Who should be responsible for ensuring that students are becoming information literate? And then what partnerships can be developed? What institutional supports or changes are needed? So we had kind of three areas that are certainly related. So what did you think about the first one? Are they graduating with knowledge, skills, and values needed? Ish? Ish? Okay. But how do you know that? I'd be interested to hear that. How do you know that?
Yeah, I'm from nursing, and in nursing, we have an accredited.
Yeah.
And
You're very-
and we have essentials, and we have to, one
Yeah.
of them is information literacy, and we have to have outcomes.
Yes,
And we have
right.
to measure that on a regular basis, and we have to demonstrate that to our
Mhm.
accrediting agency.
Yeah.
So in nursing, we absolutely do this, and we know because we have outcomes and we
Mhm.
have measurable outcomes.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, and your profession is particularly structured in that way, and some of the others as well, certainly, you know, like the NCATE people in education, or, yeah, each, that's a really good point, so I'm sure each of you thought about that, yeah. What else? How do others know? Yes?
Well, we brought up the issue of if an undergrad is successfully, I thought I was talking loud enough. Now I get to rock the mic. No. We thought of the issue if an undergrad is successfully accepted into a prestigious graduate program or an accredited graduate program, perhaps
Right.
that's a demonstration that they've acquired knowledge, skills, and values.
Mhm.
Or if they have a paper accepted into an academic
Yeah.
conference,
Yeah.
perhaps
Right.
those institutions demonstrate that they have the acquired knowledge that we're looking for, skills and values. So.
Mhm. Okay, good. Oop. I can hold this. Thanks. Okay. Well, what about question 2? Who should be responsible? Yay! Or did you have some other idea? Maybe everybody didn't say that. Are there other ideas?
I know that Sharon was afraid you were all going to say just librarians, and we were all going to be like, but there's only a few of us, and we can't be responsible for everyone. So we like to hear that everyone is going to be involved.
Well, especially because, as we said earlier, I mean, it plays out within the disciplines. It's not a thing that's just out there by itself, so that doesn't work. So, yeah, I'm really glad to hear that. So, good. Okay, well, we got done with that one. But the next one, so partnerships and then institutional supports or changes. So those are going to be important things to look at to make this work and succeed. So what did you think there? Partnerships, supports, change? Yes. Okay, where do you think that's going to come from? Well, it's realigning your resources based on what your priorities are. So that's always the case. Yes, yes. Time is my. Yes, partnerships with the library, certainly to have, yeah, exactly.
Well, I think one of the things that came up at our table was just, again, I know everyone gets very busy, but having opportunities to simply do what we're doing today. Being able to step out of our offices, out of our buildings, to meet for a cup of coffee and to have peer reviewing, to talk about ideas, what's working in our own classes, what activities, assignments am I doing, and how can we brainstorm to think about application in your discipline of a similar activity. And so it's finding time to do that, of course, and time is money, but having the opportunities to get together is absolutely critical in order for us to continue to be successful in this area.
Yeah, I think that's really important, those conversations. And there are ways to do that, simple ways to do that. What else? Other ideas here?
One thing you also need to think about, how do you make contingent classes at 5 or 6 on Somebody's coming here, teaching 1 class at semester. How do you make that person come in and learn about information systems? How they going to become something?
Right.
How they going to be rewarded?
Yes, no, that's a really important point, and increasingly those people are becoming a majority of the workforce in some places. Yeah, no, that's a really important point. I didn't even say that. Yes.
We had one over
Okay, there, and then we'll come back over here.
One topic at our table was creating partnerships with employers who hire our students to understand what information literacy means to them, and are we
Yes.
meeting those needs with our
Yeah.
graduates?
Yes, that's a really good point.
Mary Chestnut is at our table, and she told us about a course I'd never heard of. There's an information literacy course. I never heard of that, and I'm sure all of our students can't take it, but what I asked for is, could there be some practical things that we can bring in? A lot of this is wonderful, but it's very theoretical.
Yeah,
And
so
in
how do you-
a crowded syllabus, what could we practically bring in that we're not doing? And maybe some things
Right.
from that class
Yes.
would be appropriate.
Yeah, and I think that's the next step here, is talking about some of those things. And even that book that I mentioned, the disciplinary applications, has some very practical things in different disciplines, so.
One more over here.
I think, well, what we came up with is that there's also the need to look at what the students are going to be doing in their career, and understanding that it's not just about what they know, it's how they work with others to get results. And that meant creating the environment in which they'll be able to begin to do that in their learning process. Because the work itself is problem solving, and problem solving is about learning,
Yes.
it's a learning process.
Right. Okay, well, I think in order to finish on time, we just have a few more minutes, and I think Jane wanted to wrap things up, but before she does that, I guess I'd just like to thank everyone for coming, because I think this is quite an amazing endeavor. So I'm really pleased to be here and to see all this conversation happening.
So everyone, please, yes, thank you so much, Sharon, for that.
You're welcome.
And thank you all for coming. As we mentioned, there are going to be many more opportunities for you to learn about the QEP, to learn about information literacy, to engage with information literacy. We will shortly have our website up, which will have lots of information, sample activities, assignments. We'll have a workshop series. The first of those is already scheduled. I believe it's on September 13th. Or September 13th, yes. And that one is going to be on information literacy beyond the research papers. So ways that you can teach information literacy, integrate information literacy without having to actually assign a research paper. So all of that information will be coming available. You'll start to see signs and banners and things all over campus advertising information literacy. And if anyone has any questions or comments, you can always email me, email Jen, and we are happy to answer any questions and that you guys might have about the QEP or information literacy.